The world watched in disbelief, jaws slack and eyes wide, as a firestorm of words erupted across international headlines. The trigger? A tense, electrifying international broadcast that would echo across continents. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, had just delivered a thunderous rebuke to former U.S. President Donald Trump. The clash wasn't military. It wasn't economic. It was ideological, a high-voltage confrontation between two global figures whose words would ignite a wave of geopolitical aftershocks and awaken a generation. It all began with a single provocation, an offhand, dismissive remark Donald Trump made during a private fundraiser in Texas, meant to amuse a crowd of wealthy donors. But the remark didn't stay private for long. It leaked, as all things do in the modern digital world, and within hours, it was making headlines around the globe. Burkina Faso? Never heard of it until they kicked out the French, Trump had said with a smirk. Now they think they can tell the world what to do. Africa needs guidance, not rebels. To many in the West, it was just Trump being Trump. Another day, another headline, another controversial soundbite destined to fade into the cacophony of the 24-hour news cycle. They'd seen it all before. The dismissive pronouncements, the geopolitical gaffes, the seemingly calculated offensiveness designed to dominate the media landscape and energize his base. But this time, something was different. This time, the words landed not in the familiar echo chamber of Western media, but in the rich, fertile ground of a continent yearning for change, for respect, for a voice that resonated beyond the confines of imposed narratives and historical injustices. Trump's words, delivered with his characteristic blend of arrogance and ignorance, were not just dismissed as another Trumpism. They were perceived as a profound insult, a blatant display of the very condescension Africa had been fighting to dismantle for generations. The nonchalant dismissal of Burkina Faso, a nation grappling with its own hard-won independence and striving for self-determination, was not simply a geographical oversight. It was a symbolic erasure, a denial of agency, a reinforcement of the outdated and deeply offensive notion that Africa was a blank slate, a continent to be discovered, defined, and dictated to by external powers. The comment, uttered with a smirk that seemed to betray a deeper disdain, wasn't merely about Burkina Faso. It was about the entire African continent, painted with the broad brushstrokes of Western perception as a homogeneous entity perpetually in need of guidance. The implication was clear. Africa, in Trump's view, lacked the capacity for self-governance, for independent thought, for charting its own course on the global stage. The rebels he spoke of were not just those challenging the established order in Burkina Faso. They were, in essence, anyone in Africa daring to question Western hegemony, anyone seeking to break free from the shackles of neo-colonial influence. This wasn't just a political statement. It was a cultural affront, a historical echo of the paternalistic attitudes that had justified centuries of exploitation and subjugation. The casualness with which Trump dismissed an entire nation, a continent teeming with history, culture, and burgeoning potential, amplified the sting. It was the offhand nature of the insult, the sheer lack of consideration, that truly ignited the firestorm. It was the kind of remark made without a second thought, revealing a deeply ingrained worldview that many in the West might unconsciously harbor, but which Africa was no longer willing to tolerate in silence. But in Africa, in the streets of Ouagadougou, in the hills of Bamako, in the bustling markets of Accra, those words struck a raw nerve. And they didn't fall on deaf ears. The digital age, ironically, had become a double-edged sword for the architects of Western dominance. While it had once facilitated the spread of Western narratives and cultural influence, it now served as a potent tool for resistance, for the rapid dissemination of counter-narratives, for the amplification of voices that had been historically marginalized. Trump's words, intended for a small, insulated audience of wealthy donors, were instantly amplified, dissected, and debated across the vast expanse of the African continent. Smartphones buzzed, social media platforms exploded, and the digital arteries of the internet pulsed with outrage and indignation. In the bustling marketplaces, where news spread like wildfire through word of mouth and shared mobile screens, Trump's words became the topic of fervent discussion. fueling existing anxieties and resentments about Western interference and neo-colonial exploitation. In the universities, centers of intellectual ferment and youthful idealism, students organized impromptu rallies, drafting fiery manifestos and sharing Traoré's speeches even before they were delivered. In the quiet villages, where radio remained a vital source of information, the news spread through crackling airwaves, sparking conversations around communal fires and reigniting historical memories of colonial oppression and the long struggle for liberation. The raw nerve struck was not just political, it was deeply personal, resonating with the lived experiences of generations who had witnessed firsthand the consequences of Western intervention, the plundering of resources, the destabilization of nations, and the condescending narratives that had consistently undermined African agency and self-worth. Trump's words were not just an insult. They were a painful reminder of a history that many in the West conveniently preferred to forget, a history etched into the collective memory of Africa and constantly reinforced by the lingering effects of neocolonialism. The guidance he spoke of was not perceived as benevolent assistance, but as a thinly veiled attempt to reassert control, to maintain a system where Africa remained a source of raw materials and cheap labor, a continent perpetually dependent on Western benevolence and direction. The notion of Africa being in the Stone Age without Western intervention, a particularly galling element of Trump's rhetoric, was a direct affront to the rich tapestry of African history, innovation, and civilization that predated Western contact by millennia. It was a denial of the sophisticated kingdoms, the advanced trading networks, the rich artistic traditions, and the complex social structures that had flourished across the continent long before the arrival of European colonizers. Within hours, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, young, sharp-eyed, and cloaked in military resolve, stood flanked by his generals, arms crossed beneath the Pan-African flag. Cameras from every corner of the continent pointed at him. His face was calm, his voice anything but. The air crackled with anticipation. The scene was carefully orchestrated, a deliberate display of African unity and defiance. Traoré, a figure who had risen to prominence through a revolutionary movement fueled by popular discontent with the status quo, understood the symbolic power of the moment. The Pan-African flag, a potent emblem of continental solidarity and the dream of a united and independent Africa, served as a powerful backdrop, a visual declaration of the broader context of his address. His generals, stoic and resolute, stood as silent witnesses, representing the military might and the unwavering support of the Burkinabe armed forces. The cameras, lenses focused intently on Traoré's face, transmitted his image and his words across the continent and beyond, transforming the event into a global spectacle, a pivotal moment in the unfolding drama. The calm demeanor he projected was a deliberate contrast to the fiery content of his speech, a calculated strategy to project strength and composure in the face of provocation. It was the calm before the storm, the quiet intensity that precedes a powerful eruption. "You call us rebels," he began, voice low and steady. "But it is you who have rebelled against peace, against justice, against humanity." His opening words were carefully chosen, a rhetorical inversion that immediately challenged the narrative being imposed by the West. By labeling Trump and, by extension, the United States as the true rebels, Traoré seized the moral high ground, reframing the conflict as a struggle between African self-determination and Western aggression. His voice, though initially low, carried an undercurrent of controlled fury, a simmering rage that promised to escalate. The deliberate pauses between words, the emphasis on "you," created a dramatic tension, drawing the listener into the gravity of his message. It was a masterclass in political rhetoric, a calculated appeal to the emotions and the historical consciousness of his audience. He was not just responding to Trump's insult. He was launching a counteroffensive, a powerful indictment of Western foreign policy and its devastating consequences across the globe. He stared directly into the lens, unblinking. "You meddled in Vietnam. You armed coups in Latin America. You set fire to the Middle East. And now you dare point a finger at Africa." His gaze, unwavering and intense, was directed not just at the cameras, but through them, directly at the Western audience, at the architects of foreign policy in Washington, London, and Paris. His accusations were not vague generalizations. They were specific, historically grounded, and emotionally charged. Vietnam, Latin America, the Middle East, these were not just geographical locations. They were symbols of Western interventionism, of proxy wars, of regime changes, and of the immense human suffering that had resulted from these actions. By listing these specific examples, Traoré was not just reciting history. He was invoking the collective memory of global struggles against imperialism and neo-colonialism. He was drawing a direct line between past Western interventions and the present situation in Africa, arguing that Trump's dismissive remarks were not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of Western arrogance and disregard for the sovereignty of other nations. The rhetorical question, "And now you dare point a finger at Africa," was dripping with indignation, a powerful expression of the deep-seated resentment felt across the continent towards Western hypocrisy and double standards. The silence that followed was deafening. You could hear a pin drop from Dakar to D.C. The impact of Traoré's words was immediate and profound. The silence that descended was not just a physical absence of sound. It was a pregnant pause, a moment of collective breath-holding, a global suspension of disbelief. From the bustling capitals of Africa to the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., from the newsrooms of international media outlets to the living rooms of ordinary citizens, the world paused listening, reflecting on the weight and the implications of Traoré's thunderous pronouncement. The silence was a testament to the power of his words, to their ability to cut through the noise of global politics and resonate with a profound sense of truth and urgency. It was a silence filled with unspoken emotions, shock, anger, admiration, apprehension. A silence that spoke volumes more than any immediate rebuttal could have. The geographical expanse mentioned, from Dakar to D.C., underscored the global reach of Traoré's message, highlighting the interconnectedness of the world in the digital age and the ripple effects of his words across continents. Donald Trump, he continued, "You are not just a problem of America. You are the mirror. The mirror that shows the world what America truly is, a country drunk on dominance. The war in Ukraine? A powder keg lit by your thirst for control. The chaos in Libya? Engineered by your allies in NATO. You whisper peace and breathe war." Traoré's rhetoric intensified, shifting from specific historical examples to a broader philosophical indictment of American foreign policy and its underlying motivations. The metaphor of the mirror was particularly potent, framing Trump not merely as an individual, but as a reflection of deeper systemic issues within American society and its global role. He accused America of being drunk on dominance, a powerful image of intoxication with power, suggesting a loss of reason, morality, and restraint in its pursuit of global hegemony. His direct linkage of American actions to global conflicts, the war in Ukraine and the chaos in Libya, was a bold and provocative move, directly challenging the Western narrative that often framed these conflicts as isolated incidents or the result of local factors. By accusing America of lighting the powder keg in Ukraine and engineering the chaos in Libya through NATO allies, Traoré was directly implicating the U.S. in the destabilization of entire regions, exposing what he perceived as the hypocrisy of Western claims to be promoters of peace and stability. The stark contrast between whispering peace and breathing war encapsulated his central accusation, that American rhetoric of peace and diplomacy was merely a smokescreen for its underlying agenda of power projection and military intervention. Social media detonated. Within minutes, #TraoréSpeaks was trending in over 70 countries. His words were clipped, translated, subtitled, and shared across every platform. TikTok creators turned his speech into rallying cries. African youth, once disillusioned and scattered, now felt the heat of unity burning in their veins. It was a moment of awakening. The digital realm became an instant amplifier of Traoré's message, transforming his speech into a global phenomenon. The speed and scale of the social media explosion were unprecedented, demonstrating the power of viral content in the modern age. #TraoréSpeaks became more than just a hashtag. It became a symbol of solidarity, a rallying cry for those who resonated with his message of defiance against Western dominance. The rapid translation and subtitling of his speech ensured its accessibility to a global audience, transcending linguistic barriers and cultural differences. TikTok, a platform often associated with entertainment and frivolous content, became an unexpected vehicle for political mobilization, with creators transforming Traoré's speech into short, impactful videos, memes, and musical remixes, further amplifying its reach and emotional impact. For African youth, often described as disillusioned and politically apathetic, Traoré's speech ignited a spark of hope and unity. The digital space became a virtual forum for collective catharsis, a space where they could express their frustrations, share their aspirations, and feel a sense of belonging to a larger movement for change. It was a moment of awakening, not just for Africa, but for the world, a realization of the shifting power dynamics in the digital age and the growing agency of marginalized voices. But Traoré wasn't done. "You once said America should take the oil in the Middle East," he declared, his voice rising. "Now your corporations sneak into Africa behind the smiling masks of NGOs, stealing uranium, gold, lithium, while preaching democracy and human rights. We see you. We know your games. The days of puppet regimes and silent suffering are over." Traoré's speech built in intensity, his voice rising in volume and passion, reflecting the escalating emotion of his message. He shifted his focus from broad geopolitical critiques to specific accusations of economic exploitation, targeting the predatory practices of Western corporations in Africa. The reference to Trump's infamous "take the oil" comment was a deliberate reminder of the perceived rapaciousness of American foreign policy, highlighting the economic motivations often underlying its interventions in resource-rich regions. He accused Western corporations of operating behind the smiling masks of NGOs, a cynical portrayal of the non-governmental sector, suggesting that some organizations were being used as fronts for corporate interests, masking their exploitative activities with humanitarian rhetoric. The specific mention of uranium, gold, and lithium, key resources in modern technology and energy production, underscored the contemporary relevance of his accusations, highlighting the ongoing scramble for African resources in the 21st century. The juxtaposition of preaching democracy and human rights with stealing resources exposed the perceived hypocrisy of Western powers, accusing them of using lofty ideals to justify their economic exploitation of Africa. The declaration, "We see you. We know your games," was a powerful assertion of African agency and awareness, signaling an end to passive acceptance of Western dominance. The final pronouncement, "The days of puppet regimes and silent suffering are over," was a defiant call for a new era of African self-determination and resistance against neo-colonial exploitation. Across the continent, his words were met with tears, cheers, and clenched fists raised in solidarity. In classrooms, teachers replayed his speech. In barbershops and taxi queues, strangers exchanged nods and said only one name, Traoré. The immediate and visceral reaction to Traoré's speech across Africa was a testament to its profound resonance with the collective consciousness of the continent. Tears of emotion, cheers of jubilation, and clenched fists of defiance erupted in homes, streets, and public spaces, reflecting the deep well of pent-up frustration and aspiration that his words had tapped into. In classrooms, educators, recognizing the historical significance of the moment, paused their lessons to replay Traoré's speech, transforming it into an impromptu teachable moment, sparking discussions about neo-colonialism, sovereignty, and the future of Africa. In the everyday spaces of African life, barbershops, taxi queues, market stalls, strangers, united by a shared sense of purpose and emotion, exchanged knowing nods and uttered a single name, Traoré, a shorthand for the hopes, dreams, and aspirations that his speech had ignited. This spontaneous and widespread outpouring of support transcended national boundaries and ethnic divisions, demonstrating the unifying power of Traoré's message and the deep yearning for Pan-African solidarity. As expected, Trump fired back the next morning via his platform, Truth Social, another angry strongman blaming the West. Burkina Faso should thank us for the aid we've given. Without us, they'd still be in the Stone Age. Trump's response, delivered through his preferred medium of social media, was predictably dismissive and inflammatory, revealing a complete lack of understanding of the gravity of the situation and the depth of feeling that Traoré's speech had unleashed. His characterization of Traoré as another angry strongman was a classic Western trope, used to delegitimize African leaders who dared to challenge Western interests, portraying them as irrational, authoritarian figures driven by personal grievances rather than legitimate political concerns. The assertion that Burkina Faso should thank us for the aid we've given was a condescending and transactional view of international relations, reducing complex historical and political dynamics to a simple exchange of aid for gratitude, completely ignoring the power imbalances and historical injustices that had shaped the relationship between the West and Africa. The deeply offensive claim that Africa would be in the Stone Age without Western intervention reiterated the same paternalistic and historically inaccurate narrative that had sparked the initial outrage, further fueling the firestorm and solidifying the perception of Trump as embodying the worst aspects of Western arrogance and neo-colonial mentality. His response, far from defusing the situation, served only to escalate tensions and further validate Traoré's accusations in the eyes of many across Africa and the world. And just like that, the fire reignited. Within 24 hours, Captain Traoré convened an emergency summit in Ouagadougou. Military leaders and civilian heads of state from Mali, Niger, Guinea, the Congo, and Sudan gathered around a single carved mahogany table. They wore their differences, but spoke with one voice. And in that room, beneath the shadows of decades of exploitation, they signed a historic declaration, the Pan-African Resource Independence Pact. Trump's dismissive response acted as fuel to the flames, galvanizing African leaders into action and transforming the initial outrage into a concrete political movement. The swift convening of an emergency summit in Ouagadougou demonstrated the urgency and seriousness with which African leaders were taking the situation, recognizing the potential for a transformative moment in the continent's history. The gathering of military leaders and civilian heads of state from key West African nations, Mali, Niger, Guinea, Congo, and Sudan, signified a remarkable display of regional unity, transcending political differences and national rivalries in the face of a common threat and a shared aspiration. The image of them gathered around a single carved mahogany table, a symbol of African craftsmanship and heritage, contrasted sharply with the sterile conference rooms of Western power, underscoring the African ownership of the process. The phrase "beneath the shadows of decades of exploitation" evoked the historical context of their meeting, reminding them and the world of a long legacy of colonial and neo-colonial resource extraction that had impoverished the continent and fueled Western prosperity. The signing of the Pan-African Resource Independence Pact was the culmination of this historic summit, a tangible manifestation of their collective resolve to break free from the chains of economic dependence and reclaim control over their own destinies. No more will foreign corporations dig African soil and leave behind dust. No more will puppet governments sell national treasure for handouts. The pact pledged to nationalize critical mining sectors, expel predatory Western corporations, establish sovereign wealth funds for African nations, launch a continental development bank funded by African resources, reinvest profits into education, healthcare, and infrastructure for Africans by Africans. The declaration of the pact was a bold and unequivocal statement of intent, outlining concrete measures to dismantle the neo-colonial economic structures that had long plagued the continent. The phrase "no more will foreign corporations dig African soil and leave behind dust" encapsulated the core grievance. The exploitative practice of resource extraction that had enriched Western corporations while leaving African nations impoverished and environmentally degraded. The condemnation of puppet governments selling national treasure for handouts directly addressed the issue of corruption and compromised sovereignty, highlighting the complicity of some African leaders in perpetuating the system of neo-colonial exploitation. The 5 key pillars of the pact: nationalization, expulsion, sovereign wealth funds, a continental development bank, and reinvestment in social infrastructure, were not mere slogans. They were concrete policy proposals designed to fundamentally reshape the economic relationship between Africa and the West. Nationalization of critical mining sectors aimed to reclaim national ownership and control over strategic resources, ensuring that the benefits of resource extraction accrued to African nations rather than foreign corporations. Expelling predatory Western corporations signaled a clear break from a past and a commitment to prioritize African interests over foreign profit. Establishing sovereign wealth funds aimed to manage resource revenues transparently and invest them strategically for long-term national development. Launching a continental development bank sought to create an African-led financial institution to fund infrastructure projects and promote economic integration, reducing dependence on Western financial institutions. Reinvesting profits into education, healthcare, and infrastructure for Africans by Africans underscored the ultimate goal: to use African resources to improve the lives of African people and build a more prosperous and self-reliant continent. The shockwave was immediate. France remained mute, their diplomatic corps caught between denial and despair. The EU issued a carefully worded, non-committal statement calling for stability and mutual dialogue. China watched quietly, calculating. Russia offered cautious praise. The U.S. State Department scrambled, attempting to downplay Trump's comment as a personal opinion, not policy. The announcement of the Pan-African Resource Independence Pact sent shockwaves through the global geopolitical landscape, triggering a range of reactions from different international actors. France, the former colonial power with significant economic and political interests in West Africa, was rendered speechless, their diplomatic corps paralyzed by a mixture of denial and despair, grappling with the implications of this unprecedented challenge to their sphere of influence. The European Union, caught between its member states' diverse interests and its commitment to diplomatic niceties, issued a carefully worded, non-committal statement calling for stability and mutual dialogue, a classic bureaucratic response designed to avoid taking a clear stance and to maintain a veneer of neutrality. China, ever pragmatic and strategically astute, watched the unfolding events quietly, calculating the potential opportunities and risks, assessing the implications for its own growing economic and political engagement with Africa, and likely seeing a potential weakening of Western influence as beneficial to its own global ambitions. Russia, eager to exploit any cracks in the Western-led global order, offered cautious praise for the pact, seeing it as a potential ally in its own geopolitical competition with the West, and recognizing the propaganda value of supporting African nations asserting their sovereignty against Western pressure. The U.S. State Department, scrambling to contain the diplomatic fallout from Trump's reckless remarks, attempted to downplay his comment as a personal opinion, not official U.S. policy, desperately trying to reassure African governments and prevent a further escalation of tensions, but failing to fully grasp the depth of the shift that had already occurred. But the damage was done. The global chessboard was shifting, and it was Captain Ibrahim Traoré who had flipped it. In Africa, he was no longer just a leader. He had become a symbol, a lion in the age of eagles and vultures. His next speech, delivered from the historic Pan-African Congress Hall in Addis Ababa, took the message further. We do not hate the West. We reject the lie that we need saving. We are not a problem to be solved. We are a people reclaiming what is ours, our dignity, our destiny, and our voice. To the youth of Africa, this is your time. Rise, organize, build. In the weeks that followed, embassies in West Africa reported massive protests outside French and American consulates. Universities hosted solidarity forums. In Johannesburg, students unveiled the mural of Traoré alongside icons like Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, and Kwame Nkrumah. African artists released music inspired by the speech. A Nigerian rapper's freestyle response to Trump hit 10 million views in 3 days. A Kenyan poet titled her piece, "The Eagle Screamed." The lion roared louder. As the dust settled, analysts began calling it a turning point, a Berlin Wall moment for neocolonialism. And yet, amidst all the headlines, there was one undeniable truth. Burkina Faso had spoken, and Africa listened. The age of silent colonization was over. A new chapter was being written by those who had been silenced for too long. With passion, with power, with pride. Let the world take note. If you're captivated by this story and want more bold, untold narratives that shake the status quo, smash that subscribe button now. We uncover the truths behind the headlines, amplify voices too often ignored, and bring you stories that mainstream media won't touch. Subscribe, comment, share. Your voice matters. Your curiosity changes the game. Together, we rewrite history, one story at a time.